Hello.
Hello.
Good. It's great to have you here today.
Lovely to be here.
Now, I've been following your work for some time, and you have some incredibly refreshing ideas around leadership with some of the most probably accurate, I would say, theories that match the reality of what I've experienced in the corporate world. But without all the bullshit, if I may say so. And that's what I think I love about a lot of your work. For those looking to develop themselves as leaders, where would you point them first? What's the starting point? Is it looking within? Is it that self-reflection?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be an awareness of strengths and weaknesses. You know, so one of the challenges is don't become a well-rounded mediocrity. You know, when someone says to you, so Jay, you know, you're doing well, but you need to step up in your Excel, you know, in understanding Excel in order to get to the next level. But, you know, your talents don't necessarily lie in understanding Excel. They understand lying somewhere else. So as soon as you go into this, okay, and I think this will die. But as soon as you go into this, I've got this broad competency kind of thing, and I've got to have achieved X level across these competencies in order to move up. You're not actually adding value particularly. You're just becoming mediocre across. You know, you're spending no time on what you're talented at, and you're spending lots of time at what you're not talented at in order to, so you don't develop properly. So you've got to be aware of that. You've got to be pretty honest about where you need cover. If you're working with a team, okay, I'm not good at this. You have to be able to say that. I'm not good at it, and you are. So can you cover me there? And I'll ask questions as and when. But ultimately, I think it's the connections. You've got to work on the quality of your personal connections. So if you say to somebody, I'm not good at this, can you cover for me? And you don't have a decent connection with them. You've got a low quality connection with them, you're in trouble. If you have a high quality connection with them, then they've got your back. And if the whole team has high quality connections between them and connections beyond the team, then you can start doing some interesting work, because you can bring in a level of intelligence beyond that just with the team by asking other people. Yeah, partly what we're trying to do here. I mean, you're asking me, we know each other through sort of team-based activities. You can reach out to me and say, do you have my back in this space? And I've asked you to make a few infographics for me. So do you have my back in that space? That's what it looks like. But you have to have the quality of connection first, and that takes a little bit of time to develop. But and quite often that is just having coffee and chats and asking people how they are, and just paying attention to how they act in the environment, and continually doing that kind of connection work as part of your day-to-day activity.
I'd love to get under who Dr. Richard Claydon really is. So let's start with the formalities, I suppose. As a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? And was it MBA professor and one of the top 1% of the top 1% of universities?
That according to one ranking criteria, I don't know. Yeah. So I think I wanted to be a tennis player, but I wasn't good enough. So I'm a decent tennis player. I sort of play high-level club tennis, but I was never good enough to go beyond that. And I wanted to be an artist, and I did work as an artist. And my first degree was in fine art, and I worked as an artist in residence for a while. And then most of the rest of it has just been, yeah, it only makes sense looking backwards. It's sort of going forwards. It didn't ever make sense. It was just other opportunities came up. So I ended up via a number of different countries. I ended up in Denmark, and there was a gap in the market for doing some cross-cultural training. So I set up a business in that gap and worked there, and then ended up getting a master's in cross-cultural communication, which had international management as an add-on. So you had to do that plus something else. And then I fell in love with into the management stuff, and ended up doing a PhD in the management stuff. So it was all relatively accidental.
We've all been fed a certain idea of a leader, right? A highly charismatic, high achiever, you know, what I found very kind of individualistic, sometimes domineering, you know, the hero. So considering that model of leadership, where has it kind of led us now, and what are some of the implications, do you think?
I think then we can go, yeah. I mean, so the great, sort of that's the great man theory, almost. So before there was any scientific attempt to evaluate leadership, really there was this idea that great leaders were born. So all these heroic characters. So there were the poets and kings and gods, and you looked at their traits and saying, well, every now and again a great man is born with a set of traits that enables them to rise above the herd, and that's what a leader looks like. And I think that sort of re-emerged really in the 70s. So it was always there as a discourse, but it for a long time when we sort of look at leadership discourse in the early 1900s through the sort of the 1970s, it's not really there. There's a little bit around charisma, so Max Weber's work on charisma. So there's always this charismatic bit that's part of but that didn't really get translated into English until the sort of the 50s. So there's really what we would now call management as being part of the leadership discourse in that era. And we're looking, so Dr. Simon Weston, who is he wrote a book called Leadership, a Critical Text. So he argues that we've had 4 discourses of leadership. So the first one is the leader as a controller. So this is the idea that the leader controlled means of production. So the scientific management, the engineer designed how the work was to be done, and then all the workers did it. Then you had the Elton Mayo stuff, human relations movement, which is the leader as a therapist, which is the idea that all the motivational work in organizations comes out of this idea, that the idea is you motivate your employees to be happy, and then they become much more productive and high performing. I don't think there's very much evidence that works, or that is even the case. I don't think happiness and productivity necessarily interlink, but that was the theory for a long time. And then this charisma piece re-emerged in the 70s with transformational leadership. So the idea that, Simon Weston calls this the leadership as a messiah, or the leader as a messiah. So there's the idea then that again is this messiah figure that's raised above the common herd. That has initially, so in transformational leadership, they have a sort of a perfect vision of the future. And then you go into authentic leadership, which has sort of emerged in the 2000s. And they have a sort of a perfect internal self. So authenticity means mining your own self for your authentic values. And then you create an organization and an organizational culture around those values. But again, it's quite a messiah. It's like you're in a leadership position because your values are so great. So there's that messiah kind of thing going on as well. And then that ties back to great man theory. So we're seeing this kind of stuff, as the dominant leadership discourse for the last sort of 40 to 50 years. But you're seeing it fail. And you're seeing people who put these charismatic leaders, but also being incompetent in understanding the complexity of the world. So charisma doesn't mean you're competent. It just means that you can attract people to follow you, but you can't actually lead them anywhere meaningful or solve the problems of the world. So you're seeing a lot of organizations sort of crash because and I guess political systems, because this is going on. So where Simon says now, so Simon would suggest at the moment we're in a position where there are that discourse is beginning to die, because it's becoming pretty obvious to lots of us that it's dying, even though it's still taught as the main model of leadership in business schools. Because again, business schools started to become aggressive in the 1970s, and that rose in the 1970s. So it's all sort of aligned in their model of training people, consultants and executives. So that's just part of that model. But Simon argues that we're seeing, because of digital technologies, we're seeing the re-emergence of the leader as a control discourse, that actually the digital tech controls even the knowledge worker in a way that a manager or an engineer would have controlled a manual worker through time and motion studies up in the 1900s. So you can be sitting at home on your computer working from home, but you can be being surveilled all the time, and all your keystrokes can be mapped, so that you've got that kind of control thing coming out again. Behavioral economics has a lot of control. You sort of yank people into behaving into ways that you want them to. And then you've got what he calls eco leadership or ecosystem leadership, which is defined by connection, or the ability to connect, networking, so the ability to build a sort of a large network, and ethics. So he's arguing that discourse is rising, the control discourse is returning, and the other two discourses, the therapy and the Messiah, while they still exist, are being sort of squashed between these other two discourses. And then your decision is which way to go. Do you want to go to the leadership as a control and invest in all the technology to watch and control your people, or do you want to go into the ecosystem leadership where it's about participation and interactions and teamwork and distributed leadership and adaptive leadership and all that kind of stuff?
And we're seeing the impact of that control style leadership. Well, I've heard it mentioned quite a lot with the people that I'm talking to, in terms of they feel like they need to be on all the time. It's impacting their personal lives. This kind of is it like impression management? Like you've got to act like you're doing the work. Where is that leading us?
It's leading us into sort of mental disintegration for many. So I mean, I think so when you're undergoing constant impression management, so there's emotional labor going on. So Arlie Hochschild's work is the key to this. So you're constantly managing the emotional state that you give out. And if that happens, there are a number of different ways that it's going to impact you. So you can wear it very lightly. You can be totally aware that it's an act, and so that you throw on the cloak and take it off again. And it doesn't really impact you. You can do it quite happily, and then you go off and behave somewhere else. Under the work from home conditions, that is becoming quite difficult, because people are the cloak is having to go on and off really rapidly, because you don't have the threshold to cross over when you go from work to home with the commute. So it's quite challenging, but not everyone can do that lightly. Anyway, lots of people don't feel that their work role is part of them, and they actually have to live that quite authentically, and they're not comfortable doing that. So for those who deal with it lightly, that's okay for them, although time and space challenges are making that quite difficult. But for those who can't, burnout and breakdown are significant problems. I mean, they're likelihoods. The other option is to become apathetic and cynical, which is cognitively sane or cognitively sensible compared to the option of burning out or breaking down. So yeah, that's where we're going. We're going into the where you'll roll lightly and be aware of how to detach from it. And also, once you wear it lightly, you find other people who wear it lightly. So you have colleagues that you can talk to, or choose apathy and cynicism over burnout and breakdown. That's sort of the options, unfortunately. So, and again, this is research going back into the 60s. It's not like this is new. It's just not in the mainstream.
And this sort of feeds into, I know we've had a conversation about my Machiavellian tendencies before, the power the power playing, and I mention it because I feel like it's a conversation that I have, the feeling like you need to play into the politics and in order to have a chance at the playing field, right? But the risks of and playing into the politics in order to protect others, that's essentially what I did for a very long time. I thought I have to play the game in order to protect my team, but the risks of doing that is getting so entrenched. As you rise up the ladder, potentially you start filling these traits, and we'll probably have to explain what it means.
And I'm paraphrasing the actual quote, but within the body of research, is if you wear the mask too long, beware, because it will become your face. So yeah, that's one of the challenges, is you end up, so you fake it for so long that it actually becomes authentic, that you're no longer faking it, you're living it. So yeah, that's definitely one of the core challenges. Now, I don't have a problem with the sort of Machiavellian is a healthy coping methodology compared to many. Yeah, I mean, it is a way of protecting self. I mean, you can be ruthlessly Machiavellian, which is called high Mac, where you're actually, you don't care about hurting others. But low Mac would protect the self as well as trying to protect others. So that it's at a low Mac level, it's probably an ongoing, a useful ongoing strategy. I mean, it shouldn't be a problem that you become like a ruthless Machiavellian. It's a perfectly normal strategy to use, and it will protect you, it will protect those you care about, and hopefully you can use it as a technique to have a good career.
And for a moment, for the benefit of the audience, Richard, could you just explain this concept? And I know you've talked about an alternative of using humor and irony, right?
Yeah, so again, that's the space. So when we look at unhealthy coping techniques, and again, this is going sort of quite deeply into the research. So you're in this troublesome organizational environment. Impression management is everywhere. There's these demands on the roles, etc., etc. Everything's changing the whole time as well, so you're actually having to adjust according to the changing role and the changing demands of the role. Your unhealthy techniques are zeal, so you become a zealot for the organization or the way it was, or the future vision, or you become totally uncritical in terms of how you just end up living the role. And that can end up, if you suddenly laid off, of course, your whole identity gets challenged. So that's one. You can be cognitively confused. So you don't really know what's going on, but you end up you're trying to defend the fact that you're confused, which can become quite toxic. And again, self-harming. Emotionally exhausted is you're just breaking down, which we've already talked about under the constant pressure. Then you've got the game player or the Machiavellian, which is what we've just talked about. The role actor, which is wearing the cloak lightly. It's just, here's my role, and I'm throwing it off again, and this is what the audience expects. And then the ironist, who sits in between the rhetoric and reality and plays. So they see the absurdities, and they try and open up space where you can fix the absurdities and start moving things along. But yeah, they use humor and irony to cope as a coping methodology, but also that leads into possible solutions, because when you're using irony, you're not telling somebody else it's an absurd situation. You're covertly illustrating it so they work it out themselves. And once they've worked it out themselves, again, you have an ally. In theory, it doesn't always work, but in theory you have an ally because they've seen the absurdity for themselves, and then you've got a bunch of people working together to try and push things onwards.
Yeah, so it's a balance of, it's not ignoring what's happening, but it's laughing in the face of it whilst looking to solve it.
Yeah, I mean, you can have people who just poke fun, who aren't that helpful. But poking fun and trying to open up space where emergence happens and possible solutions happen. That's the kind of ironist you want, yeah.
Let's talk about kind of what advice, I suppose, or where would you start where would you tell somebody to start if they were considering their own, kind of the start of their own leadership journey? And how does that relate to where we're shifting into?
But the ecosystem discourse, and I think most of the people I talk to that I think are really good thinkers in this area, that are suggesting that that's where we're going to go, that's going to begin to overpower the control discourse. Then you've got to be looking at forming good interpersonal relationships or high quality connections. You've got to be good at getting resources. You've got to be good at judging the quality of ideas or the quality of teams. You've got to be the glue that sticks a team together and understands the contributions that each member of a team can make, and also what their weaknesses are. You've got to be able to create a psychological safe environment. There's all this kind of stuff that is a highly interpersonal kind of thing, which is hugely challenging to contemporary leadership discourse, because contemporary leadership discourse is around charisma, as we've talked about, but assertiveness and confidence, as in I am the one who makes the decisions and I'm confident in my ability, which is what So someone like Jordan Peterson would call that the masculine, the masculine leadership kind of thing. Whereas we're moving into a much more feminine, what he would call the feminine thing, which is around emergent and participatory and nurturing and creating this kind of model where it's all around dialogue, and it emerges from the dialogue rather than from one person having the power to dominate others. So we're sort of, that you can see the tensions if you go deeper into sort of these debates around the world. You can see these tensions, this old leadership discourse, which supports a certain type of person, being interrupted by a new leadership discourse. But you've also got a whole bunch of nonsense around the outside of it, so that is stopping the really good stuff emerging.
Does this feed into your work, Richard, where you talk about Superman versus
yes,
the Avengers, the collective versus very individual?
Yeah. So I find it's a metaphor. Yeah, it's a metaphor that people sort of get when you're trying to describe this. So there hasn't been a good Superman film since the 1980s, when this Christopher Reeve, I think the 70s was the first one. So this Christopher Reeve model, again, this is the emergence of the Messiah leadership. So that was when the Superman films came out. There were only ever 2 good Superman films, the first 2. After that, they've just been, and that's because the idea that somebody is that powerful and that ethical, we just reject. As at popular consciousness level, we just sort of go, that's just not interesting. It's like he's sort of the super heroic version of a godlike figure, and we just reject it as inadequate for describing what leadership looks like in the world today. Whereas the Avengers, that actually sort of, they line up with the classic Greek interpretations of leadership, where they've got great talents, but they also have tragic flaws. And in Greek literature, the tragic flaw pretty much always overpowers the great talent. So they get to a certain point, and then the flaws undo them. So Oedipus Rex is a perfect example, who has the gift of far sight and sort of clear thinking, and then finds out that his land has been cursed, and finds out what the cause of the curse is, and of course it's him, because he's slept with his mother and killed his father, and then plunges needles into his eyes to blind himself, because it's his gift is exactly what cursed him. So you've got these flaws and with Oedipus Rex it's so powerful because the gift and the flaw are the same thing, which is irony writ large. But in general, you've got a tragic flaw that undermines the power. So if you look at the Avengers, you've got Tony Stark, and he's arrogant and egotistical, and when he first becomes Iron Man, and he's sort of almost drinking champagne and celebrating it, he flies down to the journalists and said, "I am Iron Man," even though he's been told not to, because his ego gets in the way. You've got sort of Thor is immature, it doesn't want to face up to his responsibility and his birthright. You've got Spider-Man, who's naive. You've got Captain America, who's naive, and so all of them have these flaws. When they come together, so they can all do interesting work alone, but when it becomes a world, sort of a universe level threat, so Thanos in the Avengers films, they have to come together, and in coming together, they have to amplify each other's strengths and cover each other's weaknesses. And that's what a good leadership team looks like. So for me, for the first 20 films, the leadership arc is Tony Stark and Captain America. So Tony Stark goes from being cynical and egotistical and sort of a classic male leader, self-confident, arrogant, charismatic, that classic trilogy, to sacrificing himself for the common good. And Captain America goes from becoming naive, I believe in institutional power and I follow my orders, to the rebel, and then rebels and actually doesn't, sort of almost gives up his responsibilities so he can go back and live with his longtime love. And that's what it looks like. I mean, that's the emergence of a complexity, a complex understanding of leadership as part of a leadership team. And for me, that, you know, again, when Tony Stark first says, "I am Iron Man," in front of this crowd of journalists because he wants to be the big I am, and his last lines he ever said are, "I am Iron Man," when he sacrifices himself for everybody else. So there's that journey when he reimagines what Iron Man is and what the role of a leader is. And, you know, we have known this at popular consciousness level since Greek times. The Avengers are a reimagining, and the Marvel superhero is a reimagining of Greek myths to fit in modern times. And it's exactly the same understanding of leadership, but with teamwork added in, because we are modern, and an illustration of how good teamwork overcomes the tragic flaws.
Yeah, and I think we can all really relate to those stories. Now, what does it take in order to create that? I know that you talk about psychological safety quite a lot, and just to finish up, I just wanted to talk around psychological safety, what it is. But also, I know that you talk around some of Brené Brown's work around vulnerability and courage. So I just wanted to talk around some of these concepts that are coming up and the research that's proving some of this, right?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, we'll start with psychological safety. So psychological safety is basically around, it's part of the impression management discourse. So there are, you know, and we have to remember again that it's not invented by Amy Edmondson, although she's become famous for it. I mean, it was first mentioned in Irving Goffman's work, which was in the 50s, I think. I mean, again, it's a very old concept. So she believed, when she went into the research hospital teams, she thought that the highest performing teams would be the ones that made the least errors. But of course, the highest performing teams were ones that reported the most errors, because then they could fix them. So that's where she got into understanding it, and she's made a career out of it. But we have to remember that it's actually a sociological theory, not a psychological theory. So it's creating the environment where certain behaviours happen, rather than an inner self kind of thing, even though it's called psychological safety. So it's more social psychology and sociology than psychology. So there's so within Edmondson's work, so she's very strong at explaining the 4 elements of impression management that we don't want to do. So we don't want to appear ignorant, so we don't ask questions. We don't want to appear incompetent, so we don't admit mistakes. We don't want to appear intrusive, so we don't offer ideas, and we don't want to appear negative, so we don't challenge the status quo. So there are your 4 dimensions of what stops. So for me, you can divide that even further, which she doesn't go into. So you're really talking about risk and innovation. So admitting mistakes and asking questions is preventative of risk. Okay, I've made a mistake. If this mistake is actually allowed to escalate in the work I've done, if this escalates, that's incredibly risky for the ongoing health of the business. I don't understand what I'm doing, and I'm going to do it anyway because I'm scared of asking a question. Again, there's risk involved here. So you sort of deal with risk there, but the ideas and the challenges of the status quo is innovation. Okay, better ways of doing things. So really, that's what we're talking about. And you're trying to get rid of all of these, and to sort of the Brené Brown's point is you're having to become vulnerable by accepting that, yes, you are feeling ignorant as you ask the question, but at the same time, asking the question is more important than your personal feelings. So you're having to become vulnerable and have courage in doing that kind of work. So she talks about courage being kind, the courage to be kind. So you have to be kind to yourself. So you actually have to forgive yourself for those weaknesses. So before you can forgive, and they're perceived weaknesses. I mean, they're not actual weaknesses; they're perceived weaknesses. So that you're operating under the impression that they're weaknesses. So you forgive yourself for being human, because we all have weaknesses and flaws. First, and fragility. So first of all, you have to forgive yourself for that. If you can't forgive yourself for those elements of self, you're not going to be able to forgive anyone else. So that's the most. So it's an inward look first. Forgive myself for flaws and fragilities, then have the courage to express these 4 different dimensions in in an environment, and then forgive others for doing the same thing. Now the challenge is, if you get someone incredibly egotistical in a room, and they can destroy psychological safety, bang, it's destroyed, because they're judging you as you should know the answer. And that's a challenge, a leadership development challenge. So this is a leadership development challenge. How do we actually create a generation of leaders who recognize that's what leadership looks like? Because you only need one person in a position, especially one in a position of power, or trying to get into a position of power, who can destroy the collective intelligence of a psychologically safe environment with a phrase, with a word. So that's the big challenge: is how do you eliminate these people from collective intelligence decision making?
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. I could keep talking for hours. I'm gonna give you your time back. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye bye.